The cabin sat on the edge of Clearwater Lake, hidden by thick pine and oak trees that whispered in the wind like old conspirators. 4 years. It had been my sanctuary, the one place I could breathe without HOA rules dictating the color of my blinds, the length of my grass, or the placement of my garbage cans. But what made this night different wasn't the peace of the water or the crackle of the fireplace. It was the man sitting across from me, the state attorney general of the entire state. We weren't drinking beers for fun. We weren't catching up like old friends. No, he had come here for a reason, one tied to years of abuse, harassment, and corruption by the Homeowners Association that had made my life hell. But what neither of us expected was a sudden slam of the front door against the wall, rattling the cabin like thunder. Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, the woman who thought every blade of grass and every ripple in the lake was hazed to control. She had stormed into my sanctuary uninvited, barking like she owned the place. Her heels clicked against the hardwood, her shrill voice cutting through the silence. I knew you were hiding something in here. Let me tell you right now, this property is under HOA jurisdiction. And you? She froze, because when her eyes shifted to the man sitting calmly by the fire, sipping his coffee with that composed, intimidating gaze politicians perfect, her words died in her throat. The Attorney General slowly turned his head toward her, his voice quiet, deliberate, sharp as glass. Excuse me. Do you realize you've just broken into a private residence? Into the middle of an official meeting? Her face drained of color, her mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. She had no idea who she had just interrupted. And in that moment, she didn't realize this was the beginning of the end. Not just for her, but for the corrupt empire, the HOA she ruled like a tyrant. The story didn't begin with the Attorney General. It began years before, when I first bought the cabin. Clearwater Lake was supposed to be freedom, a break from the endless, suffocating demands of Oak Ridge Estates HOA, where Karen reigned supreme. I had lived in that subdivision for 5 years, and in those 5 years, she had fined me for the most ridiculous things, leaving canoe on my driveway overnight, painting my shutters a shade too dark, even for parking my truck in front of my own house for more than 2 hours. She wasn't just a busybody. She was a dictator, using the HOA as her personal fiefdom. And she had allies, a handful of board members who were either terrified of her or enjoyed the power just as much. Together, they bled the community dry with fees, fines, and special assessments, all while lining their own pockets. So when I found the lake cabin, a weathered old structure built in the 1950s, far outside HOA jurisdiction, I thought I'd found my escape. No covenants, no Karen, no rules, just water, trees, and silence. But Karen wasn't the type to let go of her prey. The first time she found out about the cabin, she drove out to the lake and waited by the dock until I returned from fishing. She stood there in her floral print blouse, clipboard in hand, acting like she was a government inspector. You didn't file a property disclosure with the HOA, she had snapped. I laughed in her face. Karen, this isn't Oak Ridge Estates. You don't control this place. Her lips tightened into a thin smile. We'll see about that. I didn't think much of it at first, just more of her theatrics. But then the letters started arriving, notices demanding that I submit cabin ownership records to the HOA. Threats of legal action if I didn't comply. She even mailed me a fine, $500 for an authorized property expansion. Expansion? The cabin had stood long before Karen even set foot in the county. I ignored it all. But what I didn't realize was that Karen was escalating. She was digging. She had friends at the county clerk's office, and she wasn't afraid to abuse her connections. And then came the day I received a phone call that changed everything. Mr. Walker. The voice was smooth, professional. This is Daniel Mercer, the State Attorney General. I'd like to speak with you regarding some matters about your homeowners association. I almost hung up, thinking it was some prank. But within 10 minutes, Mercer himself was standing at my cabin door. Tall, composed, wearing a tailored suit even in the woods. He looked as out of place as a wolf in a chicken coop. We sat down by the fireplace, and he explained everything. Complaints had been piling up against Oak Ridge Estates HOA for years. Misuse of funds, fraudulent billing, illegal property seizures. And Karen's name was on almost every report. My case, my letters, fines, threats, was just another piece of the puzzle. That's why he came to me. Not to scare me, not to warn me, but to ask for my cooperation. We need evidence, he said simply. The kind that ties her directly to the crimes. You've been targeted. You've seen her tactics. You might be able to help us put her away for good. And I agreed, because I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for everyone Karen had bullied and broken. We set a date to meet at the cabin to go over documents, recordings, and strategies. That night was the night Karen barged in like a hurricane, not knowing she had just walked into a trap. The fire popped in the hearth, casting shadows across Mercer's face as he flipped through a stack of HOA records I had collected. Outside, the wind howled against the cabin walls, and the lake rippled with a restless energy, like it knew something big was coming. Mercer leaned forward. She's going to push harder. People like her don't stop. They double down when they feel control slipping. We need to be ready for whatever she tries next. I nodded, sipping my coffee. She's already crossed the line more times than I can count. I've got recordings of her threatening me, letters with her signature, even video of her snooping around the cabin when she thought I wasn't here. That's exactly the kind of evidence we need, he said. But understand this. Once she realizes you're not afraid, she's going to get reckless. That's when she'll make mistakes. And right on cue, the cabin door slammed open. Karen's voice pierced the night. I knew it. I knew you were hiding something in here. Mercer didn't flinch. He just slowly set his papers down, his eyes narrowing as Karen stumped into the room, her phone already out like she was about to record some damning confession. She didn't even notice him at first. You think you can get away with this? She screeched, pointing at me. This cabin is under our jurisdiction, and I'm placing you under violation, fool. Then she saw Mercer. Her face went pale. Her hand shook. For the first time since I'd known her, she was speechless. Mercer's voice was ice. Do you have any idea what you've just done? Karen's jaw worked furiously, but no sound came out at first. Her phone slipped slightly in her hand, the recording app open but forgotten. The shrill confidence she usually carried like a weapon had evaporated the moment her eyes locked on Mercer. Mercer repeated, standing now, his frame towering over her. His voice wasn't raised, but it carried the weight of authority, like a gavel striking oak. Do you realize you just forced entry into private property? Without a warrant, without permission, without jurisdiction. Karen blinked rapidly, her mind scrambling to catch up. This property. She swallowed hard, then pointed a trembling finger at me. His breaking community regulations. The HOA, Mercer interrupted smoothly, has no authority here. This cabin is not under your association. And you, are trespassing. The fire crackled, filling the silence between them. I leaned back in my chair, arms crossed, savoring the sight. For years, I dreamed of seeing someone put Karen in her place. And now it was happening, in my cabin, with the highest law enforcement officer in the state standing beside me. But Karen wasn't finished. Her pride wouldn't let her retreat so easily. She straightened her back, trying to reclaim some semblance of control. You don't understand. He's been using this cabin to avoid HOA oversight. This affects property values. The bylaws. Mercer cut her off again, his patience thinning. Let me stop you there. Your bylaws are not law. They are agreements between property owners within your subdivision. This cabin is miles away from Oak Ridge Estates. Your association's reach ends at your boundary. And yet, here you are. Do you know what we call this, legally? Karen's eyes darted from him to me, then back again. No. Harassment. Criminal trespass. Abuse of authority. Mercer stepped closer, lowering his voice to a cold whisper. And if you don't leave right now, I'll personally see to it you're arrested before you can make it back to your SUV. Karen's lips trembled. For the first time since I'd known her, the mask was cracking. She wasn't used to being told no. She wasn't used to consequences. And now, confronted with a man who could dismantle her entire kingdom with one phone call, she looked small. But just when I thought she'd back down, her eyes narrowed again. She drew in a shaky breath and forced a laugh, brittle and shrill. Arrest me? You don't scare me. I know my rights. And if you think some fancy title means you can intimidate me. Mercer's gaze turned steely. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a leather wallet. Flipping it open, he revealed the golden seal of his office, gleaming in the firelight. State Attorney General Daniel Mercer, he said, his voice ironclad. You've just broken into a meeting involving an active investigation into your homeowners association. Do you want to keep talking, or do you want to call your lawyer? Her face drained of color. Investigation. The word slipped out, fragile, like glass about to shatter. That's right. Mercer didn't blink. Your name has come up repeatedly. Fraud, misuse of funds, intimidation, illegal fines. And tonight, you've given us something else to add to the list, criminal trespass. I almost smiled. Almost. But I held it back. This wasn't the time to gloat. At least, not yet. Karen staggered back a step, her heel catching on the rug. She looked like a cornered animal, weighing her options. Run. Deny. Attack. Finally, she jabbed her finger toward me again, clinging to her one familiar weapon. Blame. This is his fault. He's been conspiring against me, against the HOA. He's making things up, filing complaints, trying to destroy the community. That's enough, Mercer snapped, his voice like a whip. The sheer authority in it froze her mid-sentence. This isn't about him. This is about you, your actions, and your abuse of power. Now, leave, before I make one phone call that changes your life forever. The silence that followed was suffocating. Even the wind outside seemed to pause. Karen's face twisted with rage, humiliation, and something else. Fear. Real fear. She opened her mouth as if to fire back, but nothing came out. Finally, with a choked huff, she spun on her heel and stormed out the door, slamming it so hard the windows rattled. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the fire and the distant slap of waves against the dock. Then Mercer exhaled, running a hand over his jaw. She's rattled, he said. Good. But this isn't over. People like her, they don't go quietly. She'll double down. I nodded slowly. My pulse was still racing, but a strange calm settled over me. Karen had finally met someone she couldn't bully. And now, the real game was beginning. Mercer gathered his papers and slid them back into his briefcase. Tonight worked in our favor. She just exposed herself, bursting into a private property, admitting she thinks she has authority here. If we document everything, it strengthens the case. I stood and poured another coffee, handing it to him. So what's next? He looked me dead in the eye. We build. Records, recordings, witness statements. Every illegal fine, every threat, every time she's crossed a line. You've already got some of it, but now we go deeper. And when the time comes, we burn her whole empire to the ground. The words hung in the air like a promise. Outside, I heard the faint rumble of Karen's SUV tearing down the gravel road, headlights flashing between the trees. She was running, but not away. No, she was retreating to plan her next move. I stared out the window into the dark, gripping my coffee cup tightly. Mercer was right. This wasn't over. Tonight was just the first shot fired in a war that had been brewing for years. And I wasn't afraid anymore. Scene shift. Later that night. After Mercer left, the cabin felt heavier somehow, like the walls themselves knew the storm that was coming. I paced the living room, every creak of the floorboards echoing my restless thoughts. Karen wasn't just going to walk away. She was going to come back, and when she did, she'd come harder, louder, meaner. I knew her too well. Humiliation was her kryptonite, and Mercer had just served it to her on a silver platter. The question was, what would she try next? I didn't have to wait long to find out. The very next morning, a letter appeared taped to my cabin door. The paper was crinkled from the dew, the ink smeared in places, but the words were clear enough. Notice of violation, unauthorized use of lakefront property. Failure to comply will result in fines, liens, and legal action. My fist tightened around the letter. She wasn't wasting time. But what made me laugh, what actually made me laugh out loud, was a signature at the bottom. Karen L. Whitmore, HOA President. She had the audacity to sign it herself. No lawyer. No board approval. Just her. That was the kind of arrogance Mercer had warned me about. And now, it was going to be her undoing. I pulled out my phone and snapped a picture of the letter, then another of it taped to the door. Evidence. Every move she made was another nail in her own coffin. By the time Mercer called me that afternoon, I already had the photos ready to send. She's slipping, I told him. She taped a violation notice to my door this morning. There was a pause on the line, then a low chuckle. Perfect. Document everything. Don't engage with her directly. Let her dig her hole. The deeper she digs, the harder she'll fall. I looked out at the lake, its surface glimmering in the sunlight, as peaceful as ever. But beneath that calm surface, I could feel it. The war was just beginning. And Karen had no idea she was walking straight into her own destruction. The letter taped to my cabin door was just the beginning. Karen never stopped at one swing. She kept hammering until a target either submitted or broke. That had always been her tactic in Oak Ridge estates. Neighbors had caved under her harassment, paid her bogus fines, even moved away to escape her. But I wasn't running. Not anymore. The morning after I sent most of the photos, I drove into town for groceries. When I came back, I noticed tire tracks in the dirt near my driveway. Not mine. Not Mercer's. Someone else had been here. And when I stepped inside the cabin, my gut sank. The air felt wrong. I moved through each room slowly, checking the doors, the windows. Nothing was broken. Nothing was missing. But on my desk, the stack of HOA letters I'd saved as evidence had been disturbed. I kept them in perfect order, chronological, paper-clipped, labeled. Now they were scattered, as if someone had rifled through them in a hurry. I clenched my jaw. Karen. She'd broken in again. No witnesses, no cameras. At least, that's what she thought. I reached under the desk and pulled out a small black box no bigger than a deck of cards. A motion-activated camera. I'd installed it weeks ago, anticipating something like this. My thumb pressed a button, the tiny screen lighting up. There it was, grainy footage of Karen creeping through my living room in broad daylight, wearing sunglasses and a floppy hat like some half-baked spy. She had tried to cover her tracks, but she wasn't half as clever as she thought. She paused at the letters, rifled through them, then froze as if she'd heard something. A moment later, she darted out the door. I exhaled slowly, fury bubbling in my chest. But I didn't smash anything. I didn't storm to her house. Instead, I copied the footage to a flash drive. Evidence. Another nail in her coffin. When Mercer arrived that evening, I showed him the video. His eyes narrowed as he watched Karen rummage through my desk like a thief. She's desperate, he said. She knows we're on to her, and she's trying to figure out how much you've given me. I nodded. She's not going to stop. That's good, Mercer said, slipping the flash drive into his briefcase. The more reckless she gets, the stronger our case. He was right, but it didn't make the violation feel any less personal. This was my cabin, my sanctuary, and Karen had just invaded it again. The next few days turned into a barrage. 3 more letters showed up, one accusing me of running an illegal business from a residential property, another claiming my boat dock violated shoreline guidelines, and a third demanding I pay $1,200 in backdated HOA fees. I laughed bitterly at that last one. Backdated fees for a property that had never once been under HOA jurisdiction. She wasn't even trying to make her lies convincing anymore. But she wasn't working alone. One morning, as I was raking leaves from the porch, a man in a pressed polo shirt and khakis strolled up the path. I recognized him immediately. Brad Wilkins, one of Karen's cronies from the HOA board. He wore that smug look of someone who thought they held authority over you. "Morning," he said, adjusting his sunglasses. "Got a minute?" "Not really," I replied flatly, but he kept walking toward me. He cleared his throat, trying to sound official. "The board has been reviewing some of your activities here. There are concerns, noise complaints, environmental impact, possible violations of—" I cut him off. "Save it, Brad. You don't have jurisdiction here. You know it. I know it. And if you're smart, you'll turn around and walk back to your car before I call the sheriff." His smile faltered, but only for a moment. "Look," We're trying to be reasonable here. Karen is willing to overlook certain things if you just cooperate. I barked a laugh. Cooperate? You mean pay? That's what this is about, isn't it? His silence told me everything. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. Tell Karen I'm done playing her games. And if she, or you, or anyone else sets foot on this property again without permission, I won't call the sheriff. I'll call the attorney general. That landed. His face drained of color, and for the first time, I saw genuine fear. Without another word, he turned and stalked back down the path, muttering something under his breath. Another nail. But Karen wasn't finished. The following Saturday, as dusk fell over the lake, I noticed headlights pulling into the gravel lot near my dock. 2 SUVs. Out stepped Karen, Brad, and 3 other HOA board members. They marched down to the water like a posse, flashlights sweeping across the shoreline. I watched from the porch, phone in hand, recording everything. Karen's voice carried across the water, shrill and commanding. This dock isn't authorized. We're documenting it for immediate removal. You'll be fined daily until it's gone. Brad chimed in, parroting her nonsense. HOA guidelines are clear. No structures without prior approval. I couldn't hold back my laughter. Approval? From who? You clowns? This isn't your property. Karen spun toward me, her face twisted with rage. You think you're untouchable, don't you? Hiding up here, thinking the rules don't apply to you. Well, I've dealt with people like you before, and trust me, you're going to regret this. Her flashlight beam caught the camera in my hand. Her eyes narrowed, realizing too late she'd been caught again, trespassing, harassing, making baseless threats. You're done, Karen, I said evenly. Every word, every step you take is evidence. And when Mercer is through with you, there won't be a board left for you to hide behind. Her lips tightened. She opened her mouth as if to retort, but then she saw movement behind me. Mercer had stepped out onto the porch, arms crossed, watching silently. The board members froze. Brad looked like he wanted to melt into the ground. Karen stiffened, her bravado cracking as Mercer's cold gaze locked on her. Enjoy your evening, Mercer said quietly. I'll make sure this footage goes into the record. For once, Karen had no comeback. She toned sharply, barking at the others to follow her. They trudged back to their SUVs, the beams of their flashlights bouncing wildly, like retreating soldiers who'd realized they were hopelessly outgunned. The engines roared, gravel spat under tires, and then they were gone. Mercer stepped up beside me, his voice calm but deliberate. They are circling the wagons. She's dragging the whole board into this now. That's good. It makes them complicit. But it also means she's going to get nastier. Desperate people always do. I nodded slowly, staring out at the dark lake. My sanctuary was no longer peaceful. It was a battlefield, and I wasn't retreating. Not now. Not ever. The following week was war by 1,000 cuts. Karen had been embarrassed, twice now, in front of the Attorney General himself. That humiliation was something she couldn't swallow. And when Karen couldn't win through intimidation, she reached for every dainty trick in the book. It started with the sheriff's deputy. I was splitting firewood out back when the crunch of tires on gravel made me pause. A county patrol car rolled up the drive, dust rising behind it. The deputy stepped out, his face already weary, like he knew this was going to be nonsense. Afternoon, he said, adjusting his belt. Got a complaint call. Supposed to be illegal construction and disturbance of wildlife. I almost laughed. Let me guess, Karen Whitmore. His expression didn't change, but his silence was enough. I wiped the sweat from my brow and gestured toward the cabin. Take a look around. No construction, no bulldozers, no dynamite. Just me, my cabin, and a stack of firewood. The deputy gave a quick glance around, clearly uninterested. Yeah, that's what I figured. Look, between you and me, she's called in 6 complaints this month. None of them stick, but I still have to check. I leaned on my axe, narrowing my eyes. And how many more times are you going to waste gas driving out here before you realize she's abusing the system? He shifted uncomfortably. My hands are tied. If someone files a complaint, I'm obligated to respond. Doesn't mean I enjoy being her errand boy. I sighed, then walked inside. A moment later, I returned with a folder of papers and handed it to him. Inside were copies of every bogus violation letter Karen had sent me, plus photos and the video still from her trespassing. Next time she calls, I said firmly, remember this. She's not a concerned citizen. She's running a campaign of harassment. And if she keeps wasting county resources, I'm going to file a complaint of my own. The deputy flipped through the pages, his jaw tightening. Finally, he nodded. Understood. I'll make a note in the system. He didn't say more, but I could tell he was tired of her games too. When he left, the gravel crunch fading into the distance, I felt a flicker of satisfaction. Another piece of evidence. Another ally, however reluctant. But Karen wasn't content with police complaints. She moved on to smear tactics. 2 days later, a neighbor from Oak Ridge Estates called me, his voice low and apologetic. Hey, just thought you should know. Karen's been spreading word that you're, running some kind of illegal Airbnb out of the cabin. I nearly choked on my coffee. An Airbnb? I live here part-time. I don't rent it to anyone. Yeah, I figured it was bogus, he said. But she's telling folks you're bringing in strangers, hurting property values, attracting undesirable types. Undesirable types. I repeated, bitterness in my voice. That was Karen's go-to phrase whenever she wanted to vilify someone. By the end of the week, the rumor had morphed. According to Karen's whisper campaign, I was also laundering money, running an unlicensed fishing business, and hosting late-night parties with outsiders. Each version was more absurd than the last. I'd spent years being her target, but now I realized something important. Her desperation was making her sloppy. People were beginning to doubt her. A few neighbors even called me directly to apologize, admitting they didn't believe a word of it. I recorded every conversation, with their permission, evidence. Another stone for the wall Mercer was building. Still, Karen's most dangerous move came at night. It was close to midnight when I woke to the sound of crunching gravel outside the cabin. I slipped out of bed, grabbed my flashlight, and peered through the window. Headlights swept across the trees, then cut out. My heart pounded as I crept to the porch. In the pale moonlight, I saw 2 figures crouched by the dock. They weren't fishing. They were carrying something, metal tools glinting under the moon. Sabotage. I stormed down the steps, flashlight beam cutting through the dark. Hey! The figures froze, then bolted toward the SUVs. Karen's voice sliced through the night. Go! 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 The engines roared, gravel sprayed, and within seconds they were gone. But not before I caught it all on camera. The license plates, the tools, and Karen herself, caught like a thief in the night. I called Mercer immediately. He picked up on the second ring, his voice steady even at that hour. She tried to sabotage my dock, I told him, breathless. I caught her on video. Perfect, Mercer replied without hesitation. Save the footage. I'll have my office subpoena the county for the plates tomorrow. She's building her own case for us. I sat on the porch long after the call ended, the cool air biting at my skin. My dock creaked softly in the night breeze, but it was still standing. Karen had failed. Again. The next day, Mercer came back to the cabin. He spread my growing pile of evidence across the table. Letters, photos, recordings, the new video. The mountain was growing, each piece sharper than the last. He tapped the sabotage footage. This one is gold. Criminal intent. Malicious damage to property. Conspiracy, since she had help. Combine that with the trespassing, harassment, and fraud. He leaned back, a rare smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. She's cornered, and she doesn't even know it yet. I rubbed my temples, exhaustion finally catching up to me. She's not going to stop until someone stops her. Mercer's eyes burned with quiet resolve. That's exactly what we're going to do. But Mercer was right about one thing. Karen wasn't done. The very next evening, as the sun dipped behind the tree line, I spotted her SUV parked at the far end of the road. She wasn't coming up the drive this time. She was just watching. I stood on the porch, arms crossed, staring her down across the distance. She stayed there for nearly 20 minutes, engine idling, before finally pulling away. It was intimidation, pure and simple. A silent message, I'm still here. I'm not afraid. But the truth was, she was afraid. That's why she was spiraling. That's why she was making mistakes. And every mistake was another step closer to her downfall. As night fell and the lake shimmered under the stars, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Hope. For the first time, the balance of power was shifting. And Karen, for all her bluster, was losing control. The morning after Karen's dramatic intrusion had left the entire lakefront community buzzing. Word traveled fast in small towns, and even faster when the story involved an HOA president storming into private property, screaming at the owner, and then realizing too late that she had just barged in on the state attorney general. People whispered at the diner, at the gas station, even outside the bait and tackle shop near the docks. The cabin, once my quiet refuge, had suddenly turned into the most infamous place on the lake. I woke up early that day, sunlight creeping through the blinds, the faint scent of pine filling the air. The cabin had always been my safe place, the one corner of the world where I could retreat from the constant grind of my job in the city. But now, the sanctuary felt like a stage, with a curtain pulled back and all eyes watching. The Attorney General, Mr. Carter, had stayed the night in the guest room upstairs. He wasn't just a guest anymore. He was a witness. His presence changed the entire equation of my feud with Karen and her iron-fisted HOA. I had dealt with fines, threats, and harassment before, but this was different. Now I had the law, quite literally, sitting under my roof. I made coffee and sat on the porch, waiting for Carter to wake. Across the lake, I spotted Karen pacing back and forth on a deck like a caged animal. Even from this distance, I could feel her rage. She had been embarrassed, humiliated, and most of all, exposed. People were starting to question her leadership, and if there was one thing Karen couldn't stand, it was losing control. By mid-morning, Carter joined me outside, coffee mug in hand. He was calm, collected, but I could tell he was already thinking 10 steps ahead. "She's going to come after you harder now," he said plainly, as though predicting the weather. "I figured as much," I replied, staring at the ripples across the lake. "But after last night, she can't possibly think she has the upper hand anymore." Carter gave a small chuckle. "You underestimate how desperate people become when they feel power slipping away. I've seen it too many times. Politicians, CEOs, local officials. They don't go quietly." The words hung heavy in the air. He wasn't just warning me. He was preparing me. Later that afternoon, I got my first taste of what Carter meant. A white envelope was taped to my cabin door. Inside was an official-looking letter on HOA letterhead, filled with accusations that I had violated community safety protocols by harboring unauthorized guests. It demanded an immediate fine of $5,000, payable within 10 days, or further legal action would be pursued. I almost laughed. It was absurd, illegal, even, but it was also Karen's style. She thrived on intimidation. The problem was, intimidation worked on most of the other residents. They paid their fines, kept their heads down, and let Karen run the show. But I wasn't most residents. Carter read the letter and shook his head. "She's overreaching. This isn't just harassment anymore. It's abuse of authority. If she keeps pushing, she's setting herself up for a legal nightmare." That night, Karen escalated further. Around 9 p.m., I heard a car pull up outside. Then came the blinding glare of headlights aimed directly into my living room. She was parked at the end of my driveway, engine rumbling, trying to make her presence felt. I pulled back the curtain and saw her sitting there in the driver's seat, phone pressed to her ear. "She's trying to rattle you," Carter said from behind me, his voice steady. "But the moment you take the bait, she wins." I turned away from the window, trying to focus on the flickering fireplace instead. But deep down, I knew this was just the beginning. The next day, the war turned public. Karen called an emergency HOA meeting at the clubhouse. Notices were slipped under every resident's door, urging immediate attendance to address a serious violation of community integrity. Carter insisted we go. If you don't show, she'll spin the narrative uncontested. But if we're there, well, let's just say I'd like to hear how she explains herself. The clubhouse was packed, the tension palpable. Karen stood at the front, arms crossed, her voice sharp as she launched into a tirade about outsiders undermining the peace of our community. She never mentioned Carter by name, but the implication was clear. She painted me as reckless, a rule breaker who endangered everyone by inviting strangers without proper HOA vetting. Then she made her mistake. "And let me remind you," she declared, her face red with fury, "we have every right to enter any property at any time if we believe community rules are being violated." The room erupted in murmurs. Some nodded in agreement, too afraid to challenge her, but others looked uneasy. That was when Carter stood. "Excuse me," he said, his calm voice slicing through the noise. "But what you just claimed is not only false, it's unlawful. HOA covenants do not give you, or anyone else, the authority to forcibly enter private property without consent. That is trespassing. And as it happens, I was present last night when you barged into this gentleman's cabin." The silence was deafening. Heads turned, eyes widened, and whispers spread like wildfire. Karen froze, her mouth slightly open, realizing too late that the very man she was vilifying was a top law enforcement officer in the state. Carter continued, "Let me make this clear. Abuse of HOA power is a growing issue, and I take it very seriously. Residents of this community should not live in fear of harassment or unlawful intrusion." Karen's face drained a color. For the first time, she looked small, cornered. But that was when her mask cracked. "You think you can come in here and tell us how to run our community?" she snapped, her voice shrill. "This isn't the state's business. It's ours. We make the rules." Carter didn't flinch. He simply folded his arms and said, "The law makes the rules, Mrs. Caldwell, and I enforce them." The room erupted again, but this time the tide had shifted. People who had once been silent were speaking up, questioning fines they had paid, restrictions they had endured. Karen tried to shout over them, but the momentum was gone. She wasn't the unquestioned queen of the lake anymore. She was just another bully exposed in front of her neighbors. As we left the clubhouse, Carter leaned toward me. "She's going to lash out. Desperation makes people dangerous. Be ready." And I knew he was right. Karen had just lost her grip, and now she'd do anything to get it back. By the time we got back to the cabin, night had fallen. The air was still, almost too still, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Carter sat at the kitchen table, jotting notes, while I double-checked the locks on the doors. Then, just past midnight, came the sound of breaking glass. I froze. Carter was already on his feet. We exchanged a glance, wordless, tense. The war with Karen had officially crossed a line, and it was only going to get darker from here. The silence after that revelation was unbearable. Karen stood there, lips parted but unable to form words. Her carefully curated image of being the untouchable queen of the HOA had cracked, and the sight of the Attorney General holding the letters that could implicate her in fraud, harassment, and possibly extortion, was like watching her castle of sand get washed away by a rising tide. But Karen wasn't someone who collapsed easily. She had survived years of manipulating the board, coercing homeowners, and burying anyone who dared to oppose her in a mountain of fees and citations. Her shoulders stiffened as though someone had wound her up again, and she plastered a brittle smile across her face. "Those letters are meaningless," she snapped, though her voice wavered. "They could have been written by anyone, probably forged. People love to slander me because they are jealous of my leadership. And you," she jabbed a finger at me, her nail trembling slightly, "you've hated me since day one. You set this up, didn't you? This whole charade." I almost laughed at the audacity. Karen was drowning, but instead of swimming to shore, she was thrashing around, trying to pull me under with her. Before I could respond, though, the Attorney General interjected. His tone was sharp, each word slicing through the stale air of the cabin. "Mrs. Donovan," he said, eyes fixed on her like steel pins holding a butterfly in place, "be very careful with your next words. Forgery, slander, conspiracy, these are serious accusations, and if you make them without evidence, you will only dig yourself deeper." Karen's eyes darted from him to me, then to the stack of letters still lying on the table like a coiled snake ready to strike. For the first time, I saw fear creep into her expression. Not just fear of being caught, but fear of losing the empire she had built. Her HOA kingdom wasn't just power to her. It was identity, purpose, validation. Without it, she was just another middle-aged woman with a loud voice and too much time on her hands. She swallowed hard, trying to pivot. Look, there's no need to make this bigger than it is. We're neighbors. We all want the same thing, a safe, peaceful community. Maybe we've had misunderstandings. I'm willing to forget the past if you are. The Attorney General raised an eyebrow. Forget the past. He tapped the letters. These documents reference over 30 homeowners who claim they were targeted with excessive fines, illegal assessments, and threats of foreclosure for violations that weren't even in the HOA charter. Some of these people lost their homes. Mrs. Donovan. Tell me, how exactly do we forget that? Karen's facade faltered again. Her mouth opened, then closed. For a moment, she looked like she might actually cry, but she shook her head violently, pulling herself together with sheer stubbornness. This is all just hearsay, she insisted. You think you can waltz in here and judge me without knowing the whole story? These homeowners, most of them are liars, freeloaders who refuse to follow the rules. Someone had to maintain order. Someone had to keep property values up. That's what I did. That's what I was elected to do. Her voice rose to a near shout, echoing off the cabin walls. It was the same voice she'd use at HOA meetings when she wanted to shut down dissenters and intimidate anyone foolish enough to raise objections. But hey, against the AG, it only sounded desperate, shrill. He didn't flinch. He let her finish her tirade, then leaned forward slightly. Maintaining order does not give you the right to abuse your authority. And if you think property values justify extortion, you're mistaken. What I see here is a pattern of predatory behavior. And unless you have evidence to the contrary, I'm inclined to believe these letters. Karen's face flushed red. She whipped around to me suddenly, her eyes blazing with venom. This is your fault, she spat. You lured me here. You've been plotting this all along, haven't you? You think you're clever, sitting here with your smug little grin. But you won't win. You hear me? You won't win. I stood slowly, keeping my voice calm though my heart pounded. Karen, you broke into my cabin. You screamed at me, accused me of things I never did, and now you're trying to spin this as if I'm the villain. The truth is out, and no amount of yelling will change that. The room was thick with tension. The Attorney General finally stood, tall and commanding. Enough, he said. His voice cut through Karen's rant like a blade. Mrs. Donovan, I suggest you sit down. You're making this worse for yourself. But Karen didn't sit. Instead, she made a last, reckless gamble. She lunged forward, snatched a stack of letters off the table, and tried to shove them into her purse. Papers spilled onto the floor like leaves in a storm, fluttering everywhere. Give those back! I shouted, moving forward, but the Attorney General raised a hand to stop me. Karen scrambled, stuffing as many pages as she could into her bag, her movements frantic, unhinged. You won't destroy me, she screamed. I built that neighborhood. Without me, it would have fallen apart years ago. I am the HOA. Her declaration would have been almost comical if it weren't so disturbing. She truly believed she was irreplaceable, that her reign of terror had been a gift instead of a curse. The Attorney General calmly bent down, picked up one of the scattered pages, and held it up. It doesn't matter what you take. We have enough. Karen froze, clutching her purse tightly to her chest, breathing hard. Sweat dripped down her temples. She looked less like a queen defending her throne, and more like a cornered animal. Then, slowly, the fire in her eyes dimmed. She sank into the chair she'd refused earlier, muttering under her breath. This isn't over. It's never over. The Attorney General shot me a glance, a silent message. It's over for her, but this fight isn't finished yet. Because Karen was just a face. Behind her, there was an entire board, perhaps even developers, lawyers, maybe even corrupt officials who'd let her get away with this for so long. Taking down Karen was only the beginning. The rest of the night passed in a blur of statements, signatures, and hushed strategy discussions. The Attorney General promised to launch a formal investigation, using the letters as a cornerstone. Karen sat quietly now, her earlier bravado shattered, but every so often she'd whisper to herself, promises of revenge, threats of comebacks. When she was finally escorted out by one of the AG's aides, the cabin felt lighter, as if a storm had passed and the air had cleared. But I knew storms always returned, and this one was just gathering strength. The morning after the cabin incident, the air felt different. Not just in the physical sense, the mist curling over the surface of the lake, the faint cry of loons echoing across the still water, but in the way every sound, every movement, seemed to carry a heavier weight. I was at the cabin porch, sipping coffee, trying to gather my thoughts. The Attorney General's visit had been unexpected enough. Karen's intrusion, her wild accusations, her entitled shrieking, had escalated things into a spectacle I never could have predicted. But now, the aftermath hung over me like a storm cloud. Because one thing was certain, Karen wasn't going to let this go. From the moment she stormed out of the cabin, face red with rage and humiliation, I knew her obsession with controlling me, controlling the lake, controlling everyone, wasn't finished. If anything, she would double down. People like her didn't know how to retreat. They only knew how to dig deeper, louder, nastier. And unfortunately for her, she'd picked the absolute worst place and time to flex her HOA muscle. By barging into my cabin uninvited, by throwing accusations at me in front of the top law enforcement officer in the state, Karen had written her own downfall. The Attorney General had seen enough to understand the kind of harassment I'd been dealing with. He had seen, firsthand, what happens when unchecked local power collides with arrogance and ignorance. Still, I couldn't relax, because Karen wasn't just one voice. She had the backing of the HOA board, her little clique of busybodies and sycophants who thrived on control. And I knew that when she marched back to her people, spinning her story of trespasses and illegal meetings at the lake, they would rally behind her like zealots. The war hadn't ended. It had only shifted battlegrounds. Later that afternoon, the Attorney General called me directly. His voice was calm but firm, a professional tone that carried reassurance. "I've been reviewing some of the complaints you filed, along with record from the local sheriff's office," he said. "Your HOA has overstepped its authority multiple times. Illegal fines, harassment, misuse of funds. It's a pattern." I leaned back in my chair, feeling a wave of validation. I've been saying this for months. Karen thinks she owns this lake. They've turned neighbors into enemies, and now she's trespassing into private property like it's haze to police. "Well, she just handed us leverage," he said. "What she did yesterday. It's a violation of state trespass laws. More importantly, her behavior in front of me, that's evidence. I'll be convening a review." "A review?" I asked cautiously. "Think of it as a first step toward dismantling her grip," he replied. "But you should prepare yourself. This won't be quiet. HOA boards don't go down without making noise." I almost laughed. Noise is Karen's specialty. But deep down, I knew he was right. She would retaliate. That retaliation came faster than I expected. The very next day, I woke to find bright orange notices stapled onto the trees lining my driveway. Each one bore the HOA's emblem, followed by bold lettering. Violation, unauthorized occupancy, property subject to fines and liens. I ripped one down, fury boiling in my chest. Unauthorized occupancy? This was my cabin, on my land, purchased legally years ago. The HOA had zero jurisdiction here. The lakefront was shared space, yes, but my cabin sat outside their domain. Still, Karen had convinced her cronies to push paper threats. As if that wasn't enough, by noon, my phone buzzed nonstop with texts and calls from neighbors. Some were sympathetic, others confused. "Hey, man, what's going on? Karen says the state's investigating you for squatting. Did you really get busted by the AG for using the cabin illegally? She's telling everyone you're about to lose your property." The goal. She was twisting the narrative, painting herself as a protector of the lake and me as a villain. But this time, I wasn't alone. Because a few hours later, an official-looking SUV pulled into my driveway. Out stepped two men in suits, followed by the Attorney General himself. He didn't come here quietly. He came with intent. Karen must have seen them arrive, because within 20 minutes, her minivan rolled up, too. She barreled out, papers clutched in her hand, eyes flashing with triumph. Finally, she shouted, striding toward the AG like she owned him. "I'm glad you're here. We prepared full documentation of this man's violations. Illegal structures, unauthorized gatherings, disturbing the peace, you name it. I want his property seized immediately." The Attorney General didn't flinch. He simply held up a hand. "Ms. Davenport, I'll stop you right there. This isn't your jurisdiction." Karen froze, clearly not expecting that response. "Excuse me? I am president of this HOA, and "You are not law enforcement," he interrupted firmly, "nor do you have authority over this cabin. In fact, after reviewing the deeds and zoning maps, it's clear this property lies outside HOA boundaries. You've been issuing unlawful fines." The color drained from Karen's face, but she recovered quickly. That can't be true. Our bylaws." "Your bylaws," he said, his voice now razor-sharp, "do not supersede state law. And yesterday, you trespassed onto this man's property. That is a crime." The silence that followed was glorious. For once, Karen had no words. But then, as always, she pivoted. "This is outrageous. You're taking his side? You don't know what it's like here. We've kept this community safe, orderly. If you strip away our authority, it'll descend into chaos." The AG's expression softened, but not with sympathy, with finality. "What I saw yesterday was chaos, and it came from you." Karen sputtered, clutching her stack of papers like a shield. But in that moment, something in her posture faltered. She wasn't invincible anymore. She had been challenged in front of her audience, stripped of her assumed power. Still, I knew she wouldn't surrender. Not yet. People like Karen never walked away quietly. If anything, this public humiliation would only drive her into more desperate tactics. And as the Attorney General turned to me, lowering his voice so only I could hear, his warning sent a chill down my spine. "She's cornered now," he said. "Expect her to strike back harder than ever. But don't worry, we'll be ready." That night, as the cabin sat under a blanket of darkness and the lake rippled under the moonlight, I couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still ahead. Because while the law was on my side, Karen's weapon had never truly been legal authority. It was fear, manipulation, social control, and a cornered tyrant is often the most dangerous of all. The final clash was coming, and the lake, silent and watchful, seemed to know it too. The courtroom that morning was overflowing with bodies and tension. Local reporters lined the benches, their cameras clicking in bursts as if each shutter snap could capture the raw spectacle of justice about to unfold. The residents of the HOA community filled every available seat, some standing in the aisles, whispering fiercely to one another. They weren't here for support, they were here for blood. 4 years, Karen had lorded over them, bullying, fining, and humiliating anyone who dared defy her petty rules. Today, they finally smelled the possibility of her downfall. The bailiff's voice thundered, "All rise. Court is now in session." The room stood as Judge Marshall entered, his black robe swaying like a shadow across the chamber. He was known for his intolerance of theatrics, which made Karen's arrival a grotesque sort of entertainment. She stormed in, clinging to her overpriced briefcase like a lifeline, lips curled into a scowl so permanent it seemed carved into her face. Behind her trailed her attorney, a jittery man already sweating through his suit. I sat at the plaintiff's table, calm, collected, and deliberate. Beside me sat Attorney General Henry Wallace, his sheer presence commanding silence. His reputation preceded him, a man who'd torn down criminal syndicates and crooked officials alike. If Karen thought she could intimidate me, she hadn't factored in the weight of the law bearing down at my side. Karen immediately broke the silence. "Your Honor," she barked before even being addressed, "this entire case is a farce. I am the president of our homeowners association, and I have every right to ensure community standards are upheld. That cabin," she pointed a trembling finger toward me, "is a disgrace, an eyesore, and a violation of—" "Enough." Judge Marshall cut her short with a single word. His gavel came down, not in anger, but with a force of finality. "You will have your turn to speak, Mrs. Caldwell, but you will respect this courtroom. Understood." Karen shrank into her chair, but her eyes still shot daggers at me. The opening arguments began. Wallace rose first, his voice steady but razor-sharp. He laid out every violation Karen had committed: unlawful entry into private property, harassment, misuse of HOA funds, extortion of residents, falsified financial records, and even intimidation tactics that bordered on organized crime. Each word landed like a hammer blow. Karen's attorney sputtered when it was his tone, scrambling to frame her as a misunderstood leader who was merely enforcing the rules. But the jury's expressions betrayed their skepticism. They weren't buying it. Not today. Then came the witnesses. One by one, my neighbors took the stand. Mr. Jenkins, the elderly veteran who Karen had fined $500 for flying his American flag. Mrs. Gonzalez, the single mother Karen harassed for painting her door blue. Even Tom, a man who had once been Karen's staunch ally, admitted under oath that she'd threatened to ruin his business if he didn't side with her at HOA meetings. Each testimony peeled away Karen's mask, exposing the tyrant underneath. When it was my turn, the entire room leaned forward. I told them everything. How Karen had broken into my cabin, storming through the door uninvited and screaming accusations, completely oblivious to the fact that the state attorney general himself had been sitting inside, watching it all unfold. Gasps rippled through the audience at that revelation. The jury scribbled furiously, eyes darting between me and Karen like they were watching a wolf finally cornered. Karen couldn't contain herself any longer. She shot up, shouting across the courtroom. "He's lying. He's been plotting against me for months. This is a witch hunt." The judge's gavel came down again, harder this time. "Mrs. Caldwell, sit down or I'll hold you in contempt." But Karen didn't stop. She turned on the jury, the reporters, even her own lawyer, her voice shrill and cracking. "You people don't understand. I am this community. Without me, everything falls apart. You'll regret this. You'll regret this." The bailiff moved forward, looming beside her like a silent warning. Finally, Karen collapsed into her chair, muttering curses under her breath. Wallace leaned over to me, his voice low but steady. She just buried herself. The closing arguments came swiftly after that. Wallace's final words rang in my ears. "No one is above the law, not even a self-appointed queen of an HOA. This case is about reminding people that power is not a weapon to terrorize, but a responsibility to serve. Mrs. Caldwell has failed that responsibility in every possible way." The jury retired for deliberation. The silence that followed was suffocating. Minutes dragged like hours. Karen tapped her nails furiously against the table, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. She looked nothing like the woman who once strutted through our neighborhood, barking orders at everyone in sight. When the jury finally returned, the foreman stood tall, his voice unwavering. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Karen Caldwell, guilty on all counts." The explosion of cheers and gasps in the courtroom drowned out Karen's final scream of denial. Reporters surged forward, neighbors wept tears of relief, and Karen was restrained by bailiffs as she kicked and shrieked like a banshee dragged to hell. The judge banged his gavel once more. "Order! Mrs. Caldwell, you are hereby remanded into custody pending sentencing. Court is adjourned." As the gavel fell for the last time, I felt the weight of years of torment finally lift. Karen had built an empire of fear, but in her arrogance, she had destroyed herself. And in that moment, surrounded by neighbors who finally felt free, I realized the lake cabin, the very place Karen tried to control, had become the symbol of her undoing. The nightmare was over. Or so I thought, because as Karen was dragged out, her eyes locked on mine, and she hissed through clenched teeth, "This isn't the end.